With me now is Shona Craven, community editor at The National, and she's joined by Kevin Hague, chairman of the pro-union think tank These Islands. Welcome to both of you. Shona, can I just start with you on the issue of timing, as I was just talking to David about. Do you agree that actually there'll be a pro-independence majority, that's most likely, at Holyrood, but Nicola Sturgeon won't be in any rush to go for permission for that second independence referendum?
Well, I think we have to bear in mind that the timescales involved here, are considerable from the asking point and then potentially the legal wrangling that might follow until the vote. And I believe she hopes to hold the referendum within the first half of the parliamentary term. So I don't think there would necessarily be a long period of inactivity. And obviously, it does depend to some extent on how things go with the pandemic. She won't want to be seen as dragging her feet, but she will also be looking very closely at the polls because, of course, she doesn't want to push for a referendum that she's not confident that the yes side will win. Right. Kevin, what's your response?
Well, I mean, I agree with Shona's last point, which is she won't want to push for a referendum which she won't win. And so, in fact, I think, there's going to be a bit of a phony war now around the right to hold another referendum, because that's the fight that Nicola Sturgeon and the SNP want. Because she will sound like nobody as much as Theresa May in the coming months, I suggest, by repeating that now is not the time, because now is not the time to hold a referendum. There isn't demand for a referendum from the people in Scotland now, and were that referendum to be held, it would be lost by the yes side at the moment. But the interesting point, I think, is that whilst the pandemic is the excuse given for not wanting a referendum now, the truth is that Nicola Sturgeon will not want a referendum until she's able to answer questions which she couldn't answer during this campaign. Questions about borders, questions about currency, and questions about the inevitable austerity that would follow breaking Scotland out of the United Kingdom. And until she can answer those questions, she has no interest in another referendum. All she is interested in is having a fight with Westminster over the right to hold a referendum, because that fuels further grievance.
Right. Shona, do you think that's true? She has been called cautious. Obviously, you will have heard Alex Salmond, former First Minister, saying there needs to be more urgency around the push for a second independence referendum. Is it, as Kevin is suggesting, actually it's just convenient to continue with a phony war because those issues around border, around currency are just too difficult to answer?
Well, it's certainly a topsy-turvy situation to sort of feel like we're hearing Alex Salmond talking points coming from Kevin there. I think there are conspiracy theories too far. Some people now believe, oh, it's all a big ruse and her entire political life has been a lie and Nicola Sturgeon doesn't want independence. I think that's nonsense. I think part of the reason we've not had a full debate about the independence question is because that's not actually what we were deciding at this election. This is about having the right to a say again on the independence question. Now, there are many issues that will arise as part of a campaign, and I think from now, whether the Section 30 is requested or not, now is the starting point to get into that again and to get back to those issues, which of course Alex Salmond himself arguably didn't have the answers for back in 2014. The situation has changed significantly. We're out of the EU for a start. So the whole landscape has changed. And I think actually Boris Johnson has made a huge tactical error by coming out in the Telegraph today and saying this isn't the time. I assumed he would try to misrepresent the situation as being that only if the SNP achieved a majority would there be a mandate. We have had mandate upon mandate upon mandate. So we need to stop moving the goalposts. But I suppose I'm grateful to Boris Johnson for not creating that false scenario whereby only an SNP majority, which is extremely difficult to achieve and was a huge achievement when they did achieve it, that can't be the only threshold or the new thresholds that's created for this mandate for people having the right to the say. This isn't about declaring independence later today if there's a majority for the...
Oh, you've just frozen there. Kevin, I'll let you respond. You were smiling all the way through that.
I find it very amusing that we hear words about, now's the time to start, or, we don't... The Yes campaign, the SNP, the Nationalists, don't have answers which are palatable to the Scottish public when it comes to the question of borders, when it comes to the question of currency, and when it comes to the question of austerity, the balance of tax and spending. And in fact, what they are reduced to is persuading their supporters that the Scottish government's official statistics aren't true. I mean, these islands, we did some polling on this very recently, which showed that the majority of supporters of independence believe that the Scottish government's own national accounts are made up to disguise Scotland's true wealth. Now, if support for independence relies on that level of fact denial, it will not survive a campaign. And you certainly can't write a credible prospectus on that basis, which is why no credible prospectus exists. After 14 years of SNP rule, campaigning purely for independence, Nicola Sturgeon wakes up every day, and yes, she cares about the pandemic, but she cares about it through the prism of what furthers the cause of independence. And yet, as we've seen in the preceding few weeks, she cannot answer questions on borders, she cannot answer questions on currency, and she cannot answer questions on austerity.
Shona?
Well, the figures that are being referred to there, the government expenditure and revenue statistics, are estimates for a start. And so when you're talking about something being true or false, it's a little bit simplistic. You actually have to analyse the details properly. And also those figures tell us nothing about, if you'll just let me finish, what the figures don't tell you is how an independent Scotland would fare. And if indeed Scotland is uniquely incapable of being independent and running its own affairs, which what we haven't actually heard answers from. You're saying we've not heard answers from Nicola Sturgeon. What we've not actually heard from the UK government is any case for the union. And actually, as the polls have shown in recent times, I don't think it is a guarantee that if there was a referendum tomorrow, it would be lost. This is a very fluid situation. Obviously, the handling of the pandemic has been a disaster internationally, and Scottish people are aware of that. And so there are a lot of different things to weigh up here, including, yes, estimated figures, notional deficits, but there's a lot more education about these issues than there was, I would say, in 2014. People are looking into this, and to just dismiss the Scottish public as stupid and ill-informed and imply they shouldn't have the right to choose because they'll make the wrong decision, I don't think that's very democratic.
Kevin?
I mean, none of those are words that I used, of course, and this is fairly typical sort of straw manning from the nationalists. Nobody is saying that the Scottish government's numbers are historical, actual numbers of the current constitutional situation. Of course, that is true. Of course, that would change under independence. Nobody is saying that Scotland is uniquely incapable of being independent. Again, that is a nationalist straw man. What we are asking the nationalists to do is to be honest with the people of Scotland about the implications of Scotland becoming independent. And those implications are very real when it comes to economics, when it comes to tax and spend, when it comes to public services, when it comes to people's pensions and mortgages. And they are the questions which the nationalists have continued to avoid answering. And until they answer those questions, they will not be able to make a case for independence.
Right, but Kevin, if that's the case, if you're so confident about the economics, as you have clearly set out, and the big questions that you say the SNP and Nicola Sturgeon has to answer, why not have that battle? Why not have that independence referendum campaign? And if you're that confident that they wouldn't win in the next couple of years, then throw down the gauntlet and support it and make your case for the union.
I mean, to be honest, I think there's a case for doing that. The problem here is, and it's the one thing that both sides agree on, is now is not the time. So the idea that whilst we're dealing with Brexit, whilst we're dealing with a pandemic, that we should put this country through another divisive referendum, and the amount of political energy that would be dedicated to that when this country has so many more important issues to face. I don't think either Nicola Sturgeon or Boris Johnson thinks that's a good idea. So whilst it may be fun to sort of do the political game playing and say, actually call the SNP's bluff, okay, we'll have a referendum, school gates, 4 o'clock, it's on. Whilst, that might be a fun thing to sort of hypothesize about, the reality is that would drag this country through another divisive referendum and distract political resources and indeed financial resources away from where they should be focused right now, which is on recovery.
Right. Do you agree with that, Shona, that the priority should be elsewhere? You will know better than I will about the breakdown of polls in terms of support for independence around that issue of timing that we have been talking about. And I think it's only around 28%, correct me if I'm wrong, who say, yes, they'd like an independence referendum, but not within 2 years, or only 28% said they would like one within 2 years. Everybody else is sort of saying leave it longer. So actually there isn't quite the support there to do it in the timescale that you have talked about.
Well, I think it is really difficult to look at those figures in the current climate, because obviously people are saying, well, we don't know when the immediate threat of the pandemic will be over. So I think it's quite a difficult thing to ask people, you know, how long is a piece of string? How long is the crisis going to last? But I think it's important to point out there's been this suggestion that you can either have independence or recovery, and somehow as if the two things are divorced. And what I would say is, with regards to answering questions about how things are going to be, well, I'd like to hear some questions answered from the UK government about what austerity plans they have as part of their recovery and how that is justified, and whether we have to pay off all the debts that we've incurred from the pandemic, and whether that will happen by hitting those with the least the most, which is normally the Conservative way. So I think we need a lot of openness from both sides about exactly how they frame a recovery and who will be the winners and losers from the recovery. And if the pandemic's taught us anything, it's that we know who the Conservatives will be focusing on to make sure they're all right after the pandemic, whereas obviously what a lot of people who support Scottish independence want is a fairer society. And while this has been an awful year, there is opportunity here to do things differently. So the idea that recovery has to happen and we go back to the austerity UK status quo before we can make a change doesn't make sense to a lot of people. So I think the polling needs to be ongoing. I think people need to keep taking the temperature. And if you take the argument that it will be divisive and messy and, you know, a waste of money, maybe we should stop having elections altogether and just have Tory rule forever.
Oh, well, Kevin.
Well, sorry, just on the austerity point, I mean, the closest the SNP have come to actually being honest about the economic implications of separation was the Growth Commission report written by Andrew Wilson. That made very clear that what an independent Scotland would need to do is get its deficit under control by growing spending more slowly than GDP growth, i.e. by shrinking the size of the state. Now, any version of the numbers that you run on that, even before the pandemic, means that implies austerity, and it implies austerity far, far deeper than anything we would experience within the UK, for the very simple reason that Scotland spends more per capita. That's why Scotland currently receives fiscal transfer of about £10 billion a year, nearly £2,000 for every man, woman and child in Scotland. Now that's just simple economic facts. That's just the situation today. It's not what the situation tomorrow would be. And if Scotland was independent tomorrow, it wouldn't be receiving that money. And therefore Scotland tomorrow, independent, whilst trying to create its own currency, whilst dealing with the trade borders that it would be putting in place with its largest export market, would also need to be addressing that tax and spend imbalance. And that would mean austerity on steroids.
All right, we're going to have to leave it there, but thank you both very much for that very animated discussion. That is Shona Craven and Kevin Hague there.